Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here to bring you the second part of our 24 to 70 millimeter shootout between the Canon 24 to 70 millimeter L Mark II, the new Tamron 24 to 70 f2.8 VC G2 lens, and then also the Sigma 24 to 70 OS Art lens. Now, in our last episode, we covered, kind of absolute resolution in kind of a standard sense, different focal lengths, and kind of a short to medium distance. Today, we're going to examine the extremes a little bit more, and so we're going to start by taking a quick look at how the lenses perform at minimum focus. They all have a nice magnification ratio, and so, as general purpose lenses, they become practical for shooting objects up close. So we're going to see how they perform near their minimum focus distance. We're also going to examine infinity, because obviously with lenses that cover 24 millimeters, another application is going to be landscape use for these. So we're going to see how they perform in a real-world infinity type setting with a lot of depth, and examine the image quality performance there. And then finally, we're going to do a different kind of test, because there is one different variable in this mix. The Canon, in this case, lacks something that both the Sigma and the Tamron do. Now, in our test to this point, we have put them on a tripod, and it's been a controlled environment. And as many of you have commented and noted, yes, the Canon is still the king. It is still exceptionally sharp in an absolute sense. But what happens when you go out of the controlled environment, off the tripod, into real-world shooting, the way that a lot of people are going to use these lenses? We're going to find that that lack of image stabilization certainly does affect the results that you're going to get in handheld situations. So we'll break that down and then come together at the end with a little bit of a wrap-up and observation on, how these lenses really break down in the real world. So let's jump in, let's look at some photos. Let's just do a quick comparison at, near minimum focus. And so here, we're going to see how do they do when shooting down very close. We're going to see that the Tamron and the Canon image here, they look pretty similar, really. And in terms of the background blur, there's not a whole lot to distinguish here because there is so much blur. There is one thing that I did want to point out, and that is that maybe there's a little bit softer edging here and a little closer to a line doubling with the Tamron compared to the Canon, but not a whole lot of difference, and resolution looks pretty much the same. Comparing the Tamron and the Sigma, this is the Sigma on the left side. Let's just stop for a second looking at them globally. Both of them look nice and soft. We'll look at this defocused area, and it looks pretty much similar to me. Looking at the resolution here, however, the Sigma is, it's not quite as good at that minimum focus. And so it doesn't like that quite as well as what the new Tamron has held up more consistently there at minimum focus range. Okay, what happens if you step out to infinity? We'll just look mostly here at 24 millimeters for the sake of brevity here. But let's just take a look for landscape purposes shooting at infinity. Now in this particular scene, the Tamron has needed a little bit less exposure. And we'll also see that, there's some give and take in terms of the vignette here. And, we'll look at this corner where it's not going to be as affected by, the sky changes. And I would say that here there's a little bit more vignette, obviously, for the Tamron for the Canon than there is for the Tamron. And so that's an area where Tamron has shown some improvement. Now, in terms of resolution here in the center, again, it's the contrast thing. Resolution is actually quite similar. Contrast, however, I think does favor the Canon lens in the center of the frame. Both of these are delivering quite a good performance. There's just better contrast for the Canon lens wide open. If we look over towards the side of the frame, there's not a whole lot of difference here along the side. A bit more vignette for the Canon, a little less for the Tamron, and resolution is fairly similar. Now, if we compare the Sigma with the Canon lens here, if we jump in and look at the resolution in the center of the frame, they're fairly similar here. There's just a little bit better micro contrast on the Canon lens. It really does have some beautiful optics here. Along the edge of the frame, however, the Sigma is showing, once again, it's showing a little bit of that softness that we saw in our other comparison. So even at infinity 24 millimeters, it doesn't have quite the punch towards the edges of the frame, and that's where it kind of loses out and loses its contrast and its actual resolution. Now at f4, we're going to see that the Tamron, once again, it needs a little less shutter speed to hit our exposure value. Jumping in and looking at the resolution, we see once again that big step forward in terms of the contrast with the Tamron lens. And so now it looks, you know, I would say every bit as good as what the Canon lens does in the center of the frame. You know, pretty much what we saw at our other comparison. As we move towards the edge here, they are just, really they're more similar than they are different. You know, I do like a slight bit of the contrast here and resolution of the Canon lens. And so it's, you know, maybe a hair better than what the Tamron is. Looking at a few more spots, you know, that's pretty similar. Let's go over at the right side. And here on the right side, they look, you know, pretty much the same. You know, maybe a hair better micro contrast on the Canon lens, but optically they're very, very close. Okay, and Sigma, you notice once again, Sigma needs some extra exposure there to get a similar value, although it does look a little bit brighter here. And so we'll see at f4, you know, the Canon has taken the leap ahead. The Tamron took the leap ahead. The Sigma really hasn't, and that's something that I noted, that it doesn't get a lot sharper stop down, whereas the other two do. And once again, here at the edge, it's really kind of lagging in terms of edge sharpness compared to the Canon lens. And we'll jump back and we'll compare the Sigma to the Tamron. You can just see there's quite a difference there in terms of the resolution. So stopping it down, the Sigma is a little bit disappointing in that it really doesn't jump ahead the way that you feel like it should. Comparing here to the Tamron, once again, we see the Tamron is just delivering better contrast and better resolution in the center at infinity, 24 millimeters, and towards the edge of the frame, it also looks better than the Sigma does, just a little bit more detail rendered. Jumping over to this side, you can see what I'm talking about. It's just kind of softer and more hazy there on the Sigma side, whereas the Tamron's showing a bit more detail. Now, some of you asked after our first comparison, what about 35 millimeters? And I responded that because of, you know, just the amount of time or the length of these videos, that I wanted to try to keep them as reasonably short as possible. So 35 millimeters didn't make the cut. I'll give you a quick look here though. And so here at 35 millimeters, and note that while our exposures are the same, the light was starting to change a little bit, and so don't read too much in terms of exposure or light transmission into this. We're going to mostly look at resolution. Center of the frame, there's not really a huge difference, and I think you would be pretty challenged to really see a difference in real-world shooting. You know, as per usual, I do think that the Canon has a little bit better micro contrast wide open. But at 35 millimeters, it's not hugely obvious here, but you know, I do think it is there. If we look towards the edge of the frame here, on the left side, I do think that, you know, and there is a difference in the light here, but I do think that if I look, for example, at this building, I think that the Canon is a little bit sharper. However, if we pop over to the other side, the right side of the frame, I reverse position, and I think that the Canon gets a little bit softer on the right side than the Tamron. And of course, you know, that's specific to these individual copies, and so you know, but in the copies that I'm comparing here, they're virtually the same in the center. The Canon's a bit stronger on the left, the Tamron is stronger here on the right. Okay, so if we stop them both down to f4 and we take a look here at the center, in the center of the frame, I really think you would have a hard time saying one is better than the other. I mean, they are pretty much identical, and of course contrast has picked up for the Tamron, and so it's looking good there. As we kind of drift towards this side, the Tamron is looking, or excuse me, the Canon is looking a little bit sharper to me. It's minor, but it is there that I can see just a little bit better resolving of details. We'll pop down here and look at this little hut here. And again, I think there's a little bit more detail there on the Canon on the left side. However, looking at the right side, we see the same, kind of truth we saw at the last time. The Tamron is looking really fantastic on the right side of the frame, and the Canon is looking less so. So there's a look at 35 millimeters. So as a landscape lens, the Sigma, I think, ranks third. I'm going to put the Canon the first, and then the Tamron in the center. However, there's a pretty big caveat that's coming in our wrap-up here. So we saw in our controlled test on a tripod, very controlled conditions, that the Canon is definitely the sharper lens and pretty much at all focal lengths. And there's some give and take with the third-party lenses, but then we saw stop down that the Tamron is basically every bit as good for the most part out in the real world, stop down to f4 and beyond. But there is a final angle in real world shooting that I wanted to bring to consideration, and it was actually inspired by Paul, who loaned me the Canon 24-70. He said that this type of lens is purchased by event pros who only handhold lenses, and thus from a tripod perspective, the tripod test is irrelevant. Handholding is only what matters. For example, at people shutter speeds of 1/60th to 1/200th, what is the sharper lens? Not actually is the Canon sharper if used on a tripod, but handheld, what is sharper? On this point, my personal event feedback is that I will not use this lens on a 5DSR. There is no point at all because no added detail is achievable unless you approach 6 times the focal length. So then why am I filling cards and slowing my computer for no extra detail? To contrast this last point, on my 20 megapixel 1DX Mark II, this Canon 24-70 f2.8L Mark II is a magical lens. In fact, it is my 100% go-to all the time event lens, yet it is paradoxically useless on the 5DSR. This lens is also my favorite on the A7R II, that's from Sony, because with in-body image stabilization and 42 non-AA megapixels, you simply do not need another lens. In fact, I keep this lens on nearly 100% of the time on my Sony A7R II, as the combined setup is almost the only camera lens combo that is required for 95% of all types of photography. You can take tack sharp, repeated 1/20th of a second shutter speed images. With the 5DSR, you need 4 to 5 times the shutter speed. So let's jump in, and I thought I would do a test to verify whether or not that's true here. So we're going to take a final look here and see what our results are. This is a handheld comparison. We'll look at a few comparisons between the Canon on the left, the Tamron on the right, and but doing these tests handheld. And so this is 24 millimeters, 1/80th of a second. This is a pretty common scenario here. And so what we're going to find is in this first comparison that our results are pretty much identical here. And there really isn't an edge for either lens towards the center of the frame. And if we work our way out towards the edge, there really isn't an advantage. I would say right here at the edge of the frame, it's a little bit softer on the Tamron than it is on the Canon lens. But for the most part, the real world difference is very, very marginal at best. And so these results are now pretty much equalized. And over here on the right side, like in this area, you can see the Canon looks a hair less sharp, and that's probably just the tiniest bit of motion blur that's causing that. And for consistency's sake, I wanted to shoot more than one of these comparisons. I shot a number of them. I looked at a number of them and I'm showing you a few examples here. And so it's not a cherry picking, it's a sampling of real world results. And so here we find that in this secondary one, and this was true of several others that I saw, the Tamron actually looks a hair sharper in the middle, hair a bit more contrast. And again, that's just that difference that a image stabilizer makes in real world shooting. Out here at the edge of the frame, they are pretty much equal here. I'm not seeing really any kind of real difference between the two. Maybe the Canon looks a hair sharper up in that corner. Looking over on this side, once again, we find that the Tamron is the one that is just a little bit sharper. And again, that's a difference in stabilization. So what happens if we move out to 70 millimeters and continue to shoot at 1/80th of a second? Here's where things may start to get a little bit interesting. So definitely we saw that wide open, stable on a tripod. The Canon was definitely the stronger lens wide open at 70 millimeters. But here we see when we shoot the handheld comparison that the Tamron is every bit as sharp and has every bit as good a contrast. And again, it's the difference in that stability for real world shooting. And here, even if we go, and they don't line up perfectly, this was a handheld comparison. So even with the Tamron squeezed at the very, very top of the frame, this knot here, it looks just as good on the Tamron as it did on the Canon. Looking over at this side over here, we can see that once again, the results are basically indistinguishable. Right here in this area, I think the Canon looks a little bit sharper. But once again, if we broaden the sample size to include a couple of shots, we're going to find that in this particular one, it's definitely the Tamron that looks like the sharper of the two lenses, and its stability has allowed it, its stabilizer has allowed it to produce more consistent results, and thus it looks like it has the better sharpness of the two lenses. And so, it just goes to show that even at moderate speeds, that in real world use, that stabilizer makes a big difference. And even without resorting to extremes, what happens just if we drop the shutter speed to 1/50th of a second? And this is, it's still a very common shutter speed here. And what we're going to find is, of course, now we have dropped below that limit for the Canon lens, and we're seeing that motion blur is definitely starting to impact image sharpness here. Whereas the Tamron, if anything, of course, now to get that shutter speed, I'm shooting in TV mode, it has dropped to f3.5, and which the Tamron, of course, sharpens up anyway. But the Canon is the sharper lens in an absolute sense. But we're going to see in real world shooting in this kind of environment, there's no question that you would take the Tamron result anytime, and that's true not only in the center of the frame, but here towards the edge. There is a huge difference in the lens performance between the two lenses, and the Tamron definitely looks like the stronger lens when you're shooting handheld. And so in conclusion, as we mentioned going into the segment, what Paul says is certainly true. The Canon 24-70L Mark II is a fantastically sharp lens, but because it lacks an image stabilizer, and because Canon, of course, does not put image stabilization in its bodies, it in real world shooting becomes a little bit less useful and a little bit less sharp, because in the real world, you are hand holding. In the real world, there is some motion blur involved. And that, of course, makes the Tamron G2 version an even greater value, because it has the best of the bunch in terms of the image stabilization. From one of our previous tests, we saw that. And we saw that how in a hand-holding situations that the Tamron is not only every bit as sharp, in many situations it is actually sharper, because it is going to produce repeatable results at real world shutter speeds in a way that you won't always see with the Canon. And as Paul pointed out, as you move up to increasingly higher megapixel bodies, every little bit of motion blur becomes a little bit more obvious, because there are more pixels that are devoted to that particular blur. And so, in conclusion, the new third-party stabilized lenses from from Tamron and Sigma certainly show their merit because of having that image stabilization component. And that is something that Canon simply needs to address in the future, particularly as camera bodies seem to be trending ever more to more and more megapixels, higher and higher resolution. I'm Dustin Abbott, and I hope you've enjoyed these series of comparisons that I have been shooting with these lenses. And if you'll look at my description down below, you can find a link to my full written review of both the Tamron and the Sigma lenses, along with image galleries from each, and some purchase links from all of them if you're interested in purchasing one of these for yourself. If you haven't already, you can follow me on social media, become one of my patrons at my Patreon account, and I will have some specialized content, some further comparisons of these that'll be available to my patrons there. And so check back for that very shortly if you're already a patron, or sign up if you aren't already. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.